In the spring of 1883, a gray draft mare named Bess stood at the near edge of a 40-acre field in Holt County, Nebraska, and waited with the patience of an animal that has learned to read a person's hands before they speak. The woman holding the reins was not large. She was not young in the way that makes hard work look easy. She was 34 years old, and the field behind her was unbroken sod, and the field ahead of her was the same, and the men gathered at the grain exchange in the town of Atkinson had already decided, with the comfortable certainty of men who have not been asked, that she would be gone before the first frost. That is where the story properly begins, though the story had in truth already been turning for several weeks, since the morning in late March when Roy Harmon died of a fever that came on fast and left no time to settle accounts. Roy had been a careful man in most things, but careful men can still owe $220 to a feed supplier, and careful men can still leave 40 acres unplowed, and 2 children unfed, and a wife who had never once been asked what she thought she was capable of. Roy had come to Holt County in 1879 with a land claim and a team and a box of tools, and a young wife named Nettie, who had been raised in Illinois and who arrived in Nebraska expecting grass, and got grass, but not the kind of grass she had imagined. The kind she found was chest-high prairie bluestem, with roots that went down 4 feet and did not release the earth without argument. She had expected difficulty. She had not expected the particular flatness of the sky in winter, the way it pressed down on the roof of the soddy like a hand. She had not expected Roy to be the kind of man who talked more to the horses than to her in the first 2 years, and then, once she had learned to find her footing in the silences, to be the kind of man she was glad to have kept faith with. They had 9 years together. They had a son named Wade and a daughter named Josie. They had the 40 acres turned and planted and a decent corn yield in 1881, and a harder year in 1882, and then the fever in March of 1883, and then nothing but the debt and the field and the question of what came next. The neighbors answered that question quickly. They arrived with food, as neighbors do, and with advice, as neighbors also do. And the advice was unanimous and kindly meant, and wrong in every particular. Sell the claim. Take the children to her sister in Iowa. The land was too much for one woman alone, especially 40 acres still needing a full season's work before any harvest could cover the feed debt. The speaker most often was Clem Drury, who farmed the 160 acres to the north, and who had been watching the Harmon place with the attentive interest of a man who understood its value better than its price. Clem was not a villain. He was a man of the county, which meant he had opinions about what was and was not possible, and he held them without cruelty and without the slightest doubt. "You sell now. You come out with something," he told Nettie, standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, 2 weeks after Roy's burial. "You wait and fight the season alone. You might come out with nothing." Nettie thanked him for the food his wife had sent and asked if he would close the door on his way out. The offer he had made was $80 for the claim and the improvements. The debt alone was $220. She did not explain this to him. She did not explain anything to anyone. She went out to the barn that evening, lit the lantern, and stood beside Bess for a long while, one hand resting on the mare's neck where the coat was still warm from the day's sun. Bess turned her head and regarded Nettie with the slow, assessing look of an animal that is deciding whether the person beside her is afraid. Nettie was afraid. She was also already thinking about the plow. She began the following Monday. Wade was 13. Old enough to manage the younger stock and keep Josie fed and the fire going, while Nettie was in the field. Josie was 9 and understood more than anyone gave her credit for, which is often the condition of the younger child in a house where the news has been bad. Nettie hitched Bess to the single-bottom plow Roy had kept oiled and stored correctly, which was the kind of thing Roy had always done correctly, and she walked the first furrow before the dew was off the grass. The soil in the near field was second-year ground, broken the season before and workable, and Bess pulled clean and steady, and Nettie held the handles and kept her lines, and it went well enough that the first morning gave her something close to confidence. The second morning was harder because the south quarter of the field still had its original sod, and the roots fought back. The third morning was harder still, and her hands by Wednesday evening had blisters in places where she had not thought skin could blister. She wrapped them in strips cut from an old linen shirt and went out again Thursday before first light. The men at the grain exchange in Atkinson heard about it by the end of that first week. News in Holt County traveled along the same routes as weather and gossip, which is to say it traveled fast and arrived slightly changed. What they heard was that the Harmon widow was trying to work the place alone, which was correct. What they concluded was that it would be brief and instructive, which was the kind of conclusion men reach when they have decided in advance that a thing is impossible and are waiting for the evidence to arrive. Clem heard the same reports and drove past the Harmon field on a Tuesday morning in late April, telling himself he was going to Atkinson for a mill order. He slowed his wagon at the fence line and watched for a moment. Nettie was at the far end of the south quarter, Bess leaning into the collar, the plow turning a dark line through ground that had resisted better equipment than that. He watched for long enough to see that she was not struggling. She was working. There is a difference, and he knew it, and it unsettled him, and he drove on. If you have ever stood at the edge of a field in early spring and tried to understand what 40 acres looks like when you are the only person responsible for it, you will understand something of what Nettie was facing. If you have not, consider leaving a comment below, because the people who have seen that kind of work tend to carry it in their hands for the rest of their lives, and their stories are worth hearing. Now, the story at hand. By the end of May, she had 26 of the 40 acres turned and planted. The corn was in the ground 2 weeks later than Roy would have had it, and the wheat was thinner than she wanted, and the oats were planted in the corner of the near field that drained late and always ran short. But the seed was in and the field was alive, and the $220 debt to the Atkinson feed supplier was still on the books and would stay there until harvest produced something worth settling it with. Wade handled the kitchen garden and the 2 milk cows and the half-dozen hogs Roy had penned near the barn. He was a quiet boy in the way that some boys are quiet, not from shyness, but from an early understanding that words cost something and ought to be spent carefully. He watched his mother work and said nothing about it to anyone in town, which was its own kind of loyalty. When neighbors stopped by with the occasional question about how they were getting on, Wade answered that they were managing, which was true, and gave no further information, which was also a choice. Josie, by contrast, watched everything and stored it, the way younger children do when they sense the world is in the process of teaching them something they will need later. She brought water to the field in the mornings when the days were already climbing warm before 8 o'clock. She learned to judge by the sound of Bess's breathing and the set of Nettie's shoulders, whether a given hour was going well or badly. She did not ask. She brought the water and went back to the house, and some mornings, without being asked, she left Nettie's dinner on the fence post nearest the barn door, with a cloth over it to keep the flies off. The town of Atkinson had opinions about all of this. The feed supplier, a man named Cal Briggs, who had extended credit to Roy on the strength of 2 years of reliable payment, stopped Nettie in his store in early June and asked her in a voice that was careful not to be unkind whether she had given any thought to her situation. "I think about it every morning," she told him, "and then I go to work." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He was a practical man. and practical men in that county had a particular respect for a farmer who met payment dates, and Nettie had already told him directly in April that she intended to pay the full $220 by November from the harvest. He had not believed her then. He was beginning in June to suspend his disbelief, which was not quite the same as faith in her, but was more useful. "I'll carry the account through November," he told her. "Same as I would have for Roy." "Same as I asked," she said. She bought the seed she needed on that credit and drove home with it in the wagon bed, and did not speak of the exchange to anyone, except that evening to Bess, who received the information with the characteristic equanimity of a horse that has learned what to do with human speech. The summer in Holt County that year was the kind that arrives politely in June and becomes less polite as it goes. By the second week of July, the temperature was running past 90 degrees before noon, and the creek that fed the Harmon property had dropped to a thin crawl between banks that were cracking in the heat. The corn was holding, but the hay in the low field behind the barn was a problem Nettie had been watching build for 3 weeks without a clear answer. Roy had always put the hay up in the second week of July, when the grass was at the right stage and before the seed heads dropped and the nutrition went with them. Nettie had watched him do it 4 times, which meant she understood the timing. She also understood that cutting and stacking hay by hand, without a hired crew and without Wade being old enough to do a man's share of the lifting, was going to be the hardest continuous work she had faced yet. She started on a Thursday morning, cutting with Roy's old scythe, a tool she had handled before, only on the days when Roy had asked her to spell him for an hour. The swing required a particular rotation of the hips and a release through the shoulders that did not come naturally and came even less naturally when the arms were already tired from 6 weeks of plowing. The first day she cut a little under an acre and her back was a board by evening. The second day she cut more, because the body adapts, and by the third day she had found the rhythm that makes the scythe almost quiet. Josie worked beside her from the second day, raking the cut grass into windrows and helping Nettie pitch it onto the growing stack at the field's edge. The girl was 9 and not large, but she was determined, and determination in a child of 9 has a particular quality, a focused silence that does not admit of discouragement. Wade came out in the late afternoons after his own work was done and pitched hay until the light failed and the mosquitoes drove them inside. They cut and stacked for 9 days running. When it was done, Nettie walked the length of the stack and measured it with her eye, and decided it was enough to carry the stock through winter and leave a small margin. She stood there for a long moment with the evening coming down over the low field and the sky going pink over the creek. Then she went inside and ate supper. What she had done in those 9 days was not the sort of thing anyone in Atkinson knew about. It happened on her own land, witnessed only by her children and the stock. No one at the grain exchange would have thought to ask. The story of Nettie Harmon that summer, as the town understood it, was still a story of stubbornness awaiting correction. The story, as it actually happened, was accumulating in a different direction. The way a debt paid down in small regular amounts accumulates in a direction that eventually surprises everyone who was only watching the balance. The last week of August delivered the crucible. Nettie was finishing the last of the summer corn cultivation, working the far east field. The ground dried to something close to brick in the long heat. Bess had been working steady all morning, pulling the cultivator through rows that had gone hard on top and required the full weight of the mare's chest against the collar to break. They were 6 rows from the end of the field, with the afternoon sun flat and white overhead, when Bess stumbled, recovered, stumbled again and stopped. Nettie went to her head immediately. She knew before she reached her what had happened. The left forefoot, the shoe gone, the bare hoof against the hardpan cracked at the edge already. Not yet lame, but going there fast if she worked her another step on that ground. Bess stood with her head lowered and her breathing measured, which was the particular quality of a horse that trusts the person beside her to understand what the situation requires. 6 rows, perhaps a quarter-mile of hardpan, sitting between the morning's work and the end of the season's cultivation. The corn needed that last pass, or the weeds would crowd the rows before harvest and thin the yield. And a thinned yield against $220 in debt was a calculation that came out wrong no matter how she ran it. The wagon was at the barn. Wade was at the barn. Getting Bess back without further damage to the hoof meant walking her home slow, and going back for another solution meant losing the afternoon and likely losing the day. Nettie looked at the rows and then at the cultivator and then at the ground. She unhooked Bess from the cultivator traces, looped the reins over the fence post at the field's edge, and spoke one short word to the mare in a tone that was not asking anything further of her. Then she turned back to the cultivator, took up the handles, and pulled. A single-bottom cultivator on broken ground is not the same as a plow in virgin sod, and the soil had already been cut twice that season, which meant the hard pan beneath it had some give. It was still 40 pounds of iron with drag to match, pulled by a woman who had already worked 5 hours, and whose hands were wrapped in linen, and whose shoulders had been giving her trouble since June. She put her weight forward and found the angle, and dragged the cultivator through the first row in about the time it would have taken Bess to walk it 3 times over. She rested at the end of the row for the space of a few breaths, and turned it and did the second row, then the third. She lost feeling in her hands before the 4th row, which was the body's way of managing what the mind had decided to do regardless. The 5th row, she was counting her steps. The 6th row, she was not counting anything. She was simply moving, the way a person moves when they have passed the place where stopping feels like a choice. She finished the 6th row at the field's east fence and set the cultivator down and stood with her hands on the handles and her forehead almost touching the iron bar and breathed. The field was done. Bess was at the fence post 30 yards back, watching her with the calm attention of an animal that has waited before and knows how to do it. Nettie straightened, walked back to the mare, untied the reins, and walked her slowly home. Wade saw her come across the yard, and something in her gait, the particular set of a body that has spent everything it had and is walking on something harder than strength, brought him out of the barn at a run. She handed him Bess's reins and told him the left forefoot needed a farrier in the morning and that she was going to wash up and start supper. He looked at her hands and started to speak. "The field's done," she said, which answered the question he had not yet asked. No one had seen the last 6 rows. No one in Atkinson would know about them. They would not appear in any account of that summer, and Nettie did not tell the story at the grain exchange, or at Cal Briggs's counter, or anywhere else she went that fall. What had happened in the east field on that August afternoon existed only between her and the ground and the iron handles of Roy's cultivator and the gray mare who had waited without complaint at the fence post until it was over. The harvest, when it came, was not large. The corn yield was down from Roy's best year, though not from his last year, and the wheat was thin in the northwest corner where the late planting had given it less time to establish. But the fields had all been cultivated, and the weeds had not won, and the hay was stacked and solid, and the stock was in good condition. And the total of what she had was enough, just barely enough, to cover the debt if she could get the crop to market at a fair price, and if the threshing went clean. The threshing was where the arithmetic had been threatening to come apart since June. Nettie had no crew. She could not afford to hire one at the day rate that crews commanded in harvest season. Wade could work, and Josie could run the household and keep the stock watered, But threshing 40 acres needed more hands than her family could provide. And she had known this and had been carrying the knowledge the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket, feeling its weight each morning and not yet deciding what to do with it. It was Clem Drury who came to her in the first week of September, and this requires some explanation because Clem arriving at Nettie's door was not a gesture of generosity, whatever it looked like from a distance. Clem had a problem of his own. His wheat crop that year had come in lighter than expected, having been planted in the late window he had left himself when he spent 2 extra weeks in May watching other people's fields instead of attending to his own, which is the kind of thing that happens to men who are more interested in being right than in doing the work. He was short of enough grain to make his threshing worth the cost of a full hired crew, and his neighbor to the south had more than enough grain, but not enough hands. He stood in Nettie's yard with his hat off and explained the situation in the practical language of a man who has learned that the terms of a thing matter less than whether the thing gets done. He proposed a labor share arrangement. He would bring 2 of his hired men for 4 days of threshing on the Harmon place in exchange for a portion of the combined yield, enough to cover his own shortfall without requiring cash from either party. Nettie listened to all of it. She looked out across the field where Bess was grazing in the late afternoon light, and she thought about the east field and the 6 rows in the cultivator. And she thought about what Roy would have said about Clem Drury's offer. Roy would have said it was a fair deal, which it was. She turned back to Clem. 4 days, she said. Full crew, full effort. You get a quarter of the combined yield, no more. Clem thought about it for a moment. He had expected to negotiate. He had expected resistance, or tears, or the kind of grateful acceptance that would have confirmed his earlier estimate of her situation. He got neither. He got a woman who had already run the numbers and knew what her time and his labor were worth, and was offering him a fair price for it. Agreed, he said. The 4 days of threshing that followed were the busiest the Harmon place had seen since Roy was alive. Clem arrived each morning with his 2 men before sunrise and worked until the light failed, and Wade worked alongside them, and Nettie ran the household and the stacking and the tallying of the grain as it moved from field to wagon to the granary Roy had built in better days. The men worked without comment and without condescension, which was the natural consequence of 4 days of hard work, beside a woman who knew every corner of that farm better than they did, and who did not require their opinion of her. On the second morning, one of Clem's hired men, a young fellow named Arlo, who had been in Atkinson less than a year, made a remark under his breath to the other hired man about the general situation of a woman running a farm. Clem heard it and told him plainly and without particular heat that the woman in question had plowed and cultivated 40 acres through a dry summer without crew or complaint, and that if Arlo had a different understanding of her situation, he was welcome to explain it to her directly and see what she thought of his assessment. Arlo declined. He did not make another remark. The grain moved to market on a Tuesday in late October, Nettie driving the wagon herself with Wade beside her and the yield tallied in a notebook she kept in her coat pocket. The price in Atkinson that fall was not generous, as it wasn't generous in most years, but it was fair in the way that commodity prices are occasionally fair, which is to say it was exactly enough. She took the draft to Cal Briggs's counter on the same afternoon. Briggs took the draft and wrote the receipt, and then did something that was not his custom. He set the pen down and looked at her across the counter for a moment. "I didn't expect to see you here this way," he said. "Not with the full amount." "I told you November," she said. He nodded slowly. He slid the receipt across the counter, $220 paid in full. She folded it and put it in the same coat pocket as the notebook, and thanked him and walked out. Outside on the wooden sidewalk, she stood in the November light for a moment with Wade beside her. Down the street, 3 men were standing at the doorway of the grain exchange in conversation. One of them was Clem Drury. He saw her and he held her gaze for a moment, and then he gave a small nod, the kind that costs something to give and is meant to be received quietly. She returned it and turned to Wade and told him they were going home. The doubters had no remaining verdict to render. The season had already rendered it. The years that followed did not arrange themselves dramatically. That is the nature of the years after a hard thing is survived. They arrive with their ordinary requirements, and you meet them, and the life they accumulate is quieter than the event that started it. But it is also larger, and that largeness builds slowly in the way that fields improve under steady hands. Nettie paid off a second and smaller debt to the implement dealer in the spring of 1885, expanded the corn acreage by 12 acres in 1886, when she bought the unfenced parcel on the east side of the creek from a family that was leaving for Kansas. And by 1888, she was running a herd of 30 head of cattle on what had been the low hayfield, which Roy had always talked about converting to pasture, and which she finally converted on her own judgment and in her own time. Wade grew into the kind of man his father had been, careful and quiet and good with the horses. And he worked the place beside Nettie through his 20s, adding his strength to what she had already built and adding nothing to the reputation, because the reputation by then needed no adding to. He died of a chest illness in the winter of 1901, which was a grief the county had not expected Nettie to carry as steadily as she did, but which she carried in the way she had learned to carry things, by rising in the morning and going to work and letting the work be what it had always been, which was not a remedy, but a companion. Josie had left for Lincoln in 1892, married a man who taught school there, and raised 3 children who grew up hearing the story of the 40 acres and the 9 days of haying and the August afternoon in the East Field as the kind of family legend that seems too simple to be important until you are old enough to understand what it cost. She came back to Holt County every August without fail, and when she arrived, she always went first to the barn to find Bess, who had grown old and stiff in the way that good horses do, and who received Josie's visits with the particular affection of an animal that remembers kindness in the body rather than in the mind. Bess died in the fall of 1894, at an age that the farrier, looking at her teeth in the spring of that year, had estimated as approximately 23 years, which would have made her among the older working mares in the county, and which had surprised no one who had watched her work that summer of 1883. Nettie buried her in the far corner of the east field, at the end of the 6th row. Clem Drury never again offered to buy the Harmon place. He spoke of Nettie in town, as the years went on, with the particular respect of a man who has been proven wrong by someone he underestimated and who has the decency to know it. He hired the Harmon outfit for threshing in 1884 and 1885, reversing the arrangement without anyone remarking on the reversal. He brought his son to see the operation in 1887, which was the clearest statement of his revised opinion that he ever made, and more than sufficient. The farm grew to 92 acres by the time Josie's eldest child was old enough to consider coming back from Lincoln to work it. County records in that period noted the Harmon property as one of the more productive small operations in the eastern section of Holt County, a fact that nobody who had stood at the fence line in the spring of 1883 and watched a woman hitch a gray mare to a single bottom plow would have predicted, and that anybody who had watched her work that plow would have found entirely predictable. Nettie farmed into her 70s, which was not common and was a matter of some discussion at the general store in Atkinson in those later years, where the discussion of her had long since shifted from whether she could do it to what exactly she was made of, which is the kind of question a community arrives at after it has finished being wrong. She is buried on the hillside above the east field, on a rise where the cedars have grown up thick enough to give shade in the afternoon, and where on clear days you can see the full length of the valley and the creek running its silver line through the grass, and in the distance, the roofline of what was once the Drury place, now a different family's holding. The marker is plain, which was what she wanted, and the stone is the color of the hardpan in late August, which is not a coincidence, because Josie chose it. On the day they put the stone in, Josie's eldest child, a girl of 14 that year who had her grandmother's way of holding a tool, stood at the edge of the east field and looked out across the ground. The field was under winter wheat by then, the green rows running neat and even to the far fence line, the soil dark and turned and ready. The girl stood there for a long while without speaking, the way people stand when they are trying to understand something the land is trying to say. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn, her hands already working, already thinking about what needed doing next. That is how it was left. The field, the work, the hands that knew what to do with them. The gray mare's corner of the east field, marked only by a slight rise in the ground and a wild plum that had grown up there and was not planted by anyone. The stone on the hillside above, catching the afternoon light. The valley beyond it, going on. If you have known someone who did that kind of work, the kind that asks everything and is witnessed by no one, leave their name in the comments. The stories of those hands deserve to be remembered. And if you would like another story from the hard country, there is one waiting just ahead.